The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to you, O Lord.
On that day, as evening drew on, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us cross to the other side." Leaving the crowd, they took Jesus with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A violent squall came up, and waves were breaking over the boat, so that it was already filling up. Jesus was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. They woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up, rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, "Quiet, be still." The wind ceased, and there was a great calm. Then he asked them, "Why are you terrified? Do you not yet have faith?" They were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even wind and sea obey?" The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
I've often heard it said that teaching is an honorable profession. As students and former students, we all have fond memories of a teacher who engaged us, inspired us, went that extra mile to help us, and encouraged us to become the best versions of ourselves. Throughout the four gospel accounts, Jesus was often referred to as a rabbi, a teacher. And each time we come together for the liturgy of the Mass, we begin by listening to the liturgy of the Word. It is during this time that we allow Jesus to teach us life lessons that will enable us, as his disciples, to be fully equipped to live and share the gospel with our families and our world. One literary technique the gospel writers often used is to repeat an important teaching moment with numerous examples to amplify its importance. The more examples, the more essential the teaching point. In today's gospel, Mark uses this literary style to present the first of four stories where we hear Jesus teach us about the necessity of faith. So let us take a moment to revisit that scene and listen to the exchange between Jesus and his disciples. As evening drew on, Jesus and his disciples got in a boat and traveled across the Sea of Galilee. As they moved across the water, a violent squall suddenly appeared. Waves of water spilled into the boat, tossing them about like a cork in the wind. The disciples, many of whom were seasoned fishermen, became terrified, convinced that the boat would sink at any moment, killing everyone on board. Overcome with sheer terror, they yelled, "Jesus, don't you care that we are going to perish?" And what did Jesus do? He calmed the storm and rebuked his disciples for their lack of faith. And we might think to ourselves, what is going on here? Is Jesus teaching us not to take corrective action when faced with imminent danger? Or is Jesus inviting us to look beyond that physical storm, to see Jesus as God present with us, as Lord of our lives, that we might place our faith in Jesus without limits or conditions, no matter what storm we face? In his book entitled Prayer Life, Father Matthew El Meskin identifies three enemies that attack the faith that Jesus expects of us as his disciples. The first enemy is our reliance on empirical reason. Father Matthew observes that empirical reason hampers the work of faith and blocks its effectiveness. Our mind would tell us we can't walk on water or raise someone from the dead. Yet faith pays no attention to nature and its laws. That is why Jesus could say to Lazarus' sister, Martha, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you would see the glory of God, as Jesus then called Lazarus forth from the tomb. The second enemy is fear. Our self-love is quick to defend our own ego and pity ourselves. Faith, in contrast, is an exodus from our ego and a denial to self, allowing the disciple to put all his trust in God's faithful promises. Father Matthew observes that Daniel could face being thrown into the lion's den and exit unharmed. Or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego could be thrown into Nebuchadnezzar's fiery furnace and exit unburned, demonstrating God's power and faithfulness. Faith without fear allows us to embrace God's eternal promise. He who believes in me, even though he die, shall he live. The third enemy is skepticism or doubt. Father Matthew observes that doubt and fear are two different things. Fear is a symptom of imperfect knowledge, while doubt is a direct sin aimed against God. When Jesus called Peter out of the boat, Peter was able to walk on that water for a time, until Peter allowed doubt to enter his mind and focus on the violent wind rather than Jesus. The result? Peter sank. And Jesus reprimanded Peter by saying, "O man of little faith, why did you doubt?" As we listen to these scriptural examples, we might think, how can I know that my faith can withstand the storms that will occur in my life? And my response to that question is one of encouragement. By sharing a true life story on this Father's Day about how one family's faith was tested in the midst of a storm, along with their response. Back in the early 1990s, Troy and Marilyn Thompson were just married and settled their new family in a little town called Newberg, Oregon. 2 years later, Marilyn gave birth to a beautiful baby girl named Victoria. Troy Thompson, a 32-year-old rugged outdoorsman, was overjoyed to be a brand new father of this beautiful baby girl. About a month after Victoria's birth, Troy began to experience back pain, and it increased to the point where he decided to see a doctor to determine the cause. After 9 months of exhaustive testing, Troy was diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. Now, ALS is a rare disease that impacts only 1 in 50,000 people. It relentlessly attacks the voluntary muscles of the body, eventually stripping a person of their ability to walk, move, eat, or speak. Beyond all this, ALS has the cruel side effect of leaving the mind fully intact inside a motionless body. There is no medical cure for ALS. Over the next few months, Troy and Marilyn faced the hard reality that their prayers for a physical healing would remain unanswered, and the storm waves of ALS were felt crashing down on this young family. A few weeks later, Troy's speech became slurred, and his facial features made it difficult for Marilyn to communicate with the man she loved so dearly. When Marilyn became overwhelmed with helplessness and fear in her storm, she would cry out to Jesus with this simple prayer: "Jesus, you are my shelter in the storm." Marilyn recounts that it was during these moments when she called out to Jesus that she found the courage to go on and the strength to face the future. Troy also prayed to God, not for a medical cure, but to face his fears with an unshakable faith. A short time later, Troy was given less than 6 months to live, and he was placed on hospice. Now, since Troy lived in Oregon, he also became eligible for doctor-assisted suicide, which had just become state law earlier that year. In spite of his condition, however, Troy's faith remained focused on Jesus and the church's teaching that life is sacred from the moment of conception to natural death. Now, if Troy had embraced suicide when he first became eligible, he would have not cut his life by 6 months, but by 2.5 years. And during those 2.5 years, Troy and Marilyn's family became an inspiration to thousands of families around the world who had also struggled with other life-threatening illnesses. In 1997, the Oregonian newspaper ran a lead story about Troy's family and his emphatic opposition to doctor-assisted suicide. As a result, the Thompson Faith launched a grassroots response to repeal Oregon's doctor-assisted suicide law. Even countries as distant as Japan sent news reporters to interview Troy. And when they asked Troy if he were willing to give his own personal opinion about doctor-assisted suicide, Troy's response was slowly and painstakingly recorded by Marilyn, using slight movements in his eyebrows as she recorded each letter of his dictation. When she was finished, Marilyn showed Troy what she wrote and asked him, "Is this what you want to say?" Troy's eyebrows shifted to indicate yes. Then Marilyn turned and faced the TV camera saying, "My husband's answer to doctor-assisted suicide is this: God doesn't make mistakes, we do. God is the author and finisher of our lives." Troy's response was aired during primetime news that same evening in Japan and was replayed by other news organizations around the world. Here was a man who could only communicate by raising his eyebrows, and Troy's message of his faith in Jesus Christ, a message that honored God and the church's teaching on the dignity of life, went around the world. Thompson's story, just like the story we heard in today's gospel, is a story that teaches us to have faith in the midst of a storm. Without question, some of us are here today, are facing horrific storms in our lives. It may be the diagnosis or reoccurrence of cancer, a betrayal by a friend or a spouse, loss of our livelihood or a loved one, news of a suicide, an addiction, or even the horrific storm of prejudice and hatred that took the lives of 9 Christian men and women in Charleston, South Carolina, a few days ago. The list goes on. And when these storms occur, we get wet, and we can feel our minds react using empirical reason, fear, and doubt. Today's gospel tells us to have a different response, one that moves our faith to trust entirely on Jesus. Faith that is exemplified by the families in South Carolina who responded to their storm with forgiveness as a living modern-day example of the forgiveness that Jesus showed to all of us on the cross. Jesuit theologian Father John McMurray wrote that people who have an immature religious faith believe something like this: "Fear not, trust in God, and the things that you are afraid of won't happen to you." But for those of us who possess a more mature, enduring faith, we believe this: fear not, trust in God, and the things that you fear may happen to you, but you'll get through them trusting in Jesus. And so today, may God's grace enable our faith to mature and endure. And let us focus on Jesus, our teacher and our Lord, who is fully present in the Holy Eucharist that we will be blessed to receive in just a few minutes, who reminds us each time we receive him, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid, have faith."